The village of St. Mary Mead possessed that particular quality of English summer evenings where time seemed to move as slowly as honey from a spoon. The air hung soft and golden over the cottage gardens, heavy with the scent of roses and the promise of rain that might, or might not, arrive before morning. It was the sort of evening that invited confidences and encouraged the sharing of secrets, though in St. Mary Mead, secrets had a way of becoming common knowledge faster than the vicar could finish his Sunday sermon. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary chair beneath the ancient oak tree on the lawn of Greenways Manor, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of someone who had long ago mastered the art of appearing completely absorbed in her work while remaining acutely aware of everything happening around her. The summer musicale, revived by Mrs. Cynthia Ashford after a lapse of several years, had drawn most of the village's more prominent residents to the elegant Georgian manor house. Miss Marple, who rarely attended such gatherings unless specifically invited, had received a personal note from Mrs. Ashford, a courtesy that spoke volumes about the hostess's desire to ensure a respectable attendance. The manor's French doors stood open to the terrace, where white-clothed tables bore the remnants of an elaborate tea service. Crystal glasses caught the last rays of sunlight, and the gentle murmur of conversation created a pleasant backdrop to the evening's entertainment. Inside the drawing room, a magnificent Bechstein grand piano dominated the space, its ebony surface gleaming like dark water under the chandelier's soft glow. Mrs. Ashford herself moved among her guests with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to managing social occasions. She was a handsome woman in her early 60s, with silver hair arranged in elegant waves and an air of quiet authority that came from being the acknowledged leader of village society. Her late husband, Colonel Ashford, had left her comfortably situated, and she had used her position to become the unofficial patron of local cultural activities. Such a delightful evening, don't you think, Miss Marple? The voice belonged to Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who had settled herself in the adjacent chair with the satisfied air of someone who had just discovered a particularly choice piece of gossip. Though I must say, there's rather more excitement than one might expect at a simple musical evening. Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. Indeed, I had noticed a certain atmosphere, though perhaps that's to be expected when one introduces new elements into an established community. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's the pianist, of course, Mr. Julian Forrester. He arrived from London only yesterday, and already there's been quite a stir. They say he's enormously talented, studied at the Royal Academy, and performed in Paris before the war. But there's something rather unsettling about him, don't you think?" Miss Marple followed her friend's gaze toward the terrace, where a tall, dark-haired man stood somewhat apart from the other guests. Julian Forrester appeared to be in his early 30s, with the pale, intense look of someone who spent more time indoors than was perhaps healthy. His hands, she noticed, were those of a pianist, long-fingered and expressive, currently engaged in the nervous habit of drumming silent melodies against his thigh. "He seems rather preoccupied," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Preoccupied is one word for it," Mrs. Bantry replied with relish. "Mrs. Ashford's housemaid, Ellen, told my cook that he's been acting most peculiarly, wandering about the house at all hours, insisting on practicing on the piano well into the night. And yesterday morning, Ellen found him in the music room at dawn, just sitting at the piano bench without touching the keys. When she asked if he needed anything, he seemed quite startled, as if he'd forgotten where he was." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, which had observed human nature in all its varieties for more than 70 years, studied the young man with renewed interest. There was something in his posture that suggested a man under considerable strain. The way he held his shoulders, the quick, darting glances he cast toward the open doors of the drawing room, as if the piano within held some particular fascination or dread. "Has he given any indication of what might be troubling him?" she inquired. Well, Mrs. Bantry settled back with the satisfaction of someone about to impart significant information. There was that business with the telegram. Ellen saw it arrive this morning, marked urgent. Mr. Forrester went quite white when he read it, and immediately asked to use Mrs. Ashford's telephone. Ellen couldn't help but overhear part of the conversation. Something about debts and final notices. Most distressing. Before Miss Marple could respond, the sound of a small bell drew their attention. Mrs. Ashford had appeared on the terrace, her hands raised for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of long practice, "if you would be so kind as to gather in the drawing room. Mr. Forrester has graciously agreed to perform for us this evening. I believe we're in for quite a treat." There was a gentle surge of movement as the guests began to drift indoors. Miss Marple rose with the careful deliberation of age, gathering her knitting into its bag and following the crowd at a pace that allowed her to observe without being observed. She had learned long ago that people revealed their true natures most clearly when they believed themselves unnoticed. The drawing room filled quickly, chairs arranged in a semicircle facing the piano. Miss Marple found herself a seat near the back, where the shadows gathered beneath a portrait of some long-dead Ashford ancestor. From this vantage point, she could observe not only the performer, but also the faces of the audience, and it was often the watchers, rather than the watched, who provided the most interesting revelations. Julian Forrester entered the room to polite applause, moving toward the piano with the measured steps of a man walking to his execution. He bowed briefly to the assembled company, then seated himself at the bench with the careful precision of someone performing a ritual of great significance. Miss Marple noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the height of the bench and arranged his music. She also noticed something else, something that made her lean forward with sudden interest. The piano's fallboard, the hinged cover that protected the keys, appeared to be secured with a small brass lock. It was an unusual feature, and one that seemed to cause Mr. Forrester considerable anxiety as he fumbled in his pocket for what she assumed must be the key. The audience waited in expectant silence as the pianist prepared to begin. The room was warm with the accumulated heat of the day and the press of bodies, and somewhere a clock ticked with metronomic precision. Mrs. Ashford sat in the front row, her face composed in an expression of gracious anticipation, while around her the cream of St. Mary Mead society prepared to be culturally elevated. Mr. Forrester's hand closed around something in his pocket, and his face went very pale indeed. He tried again, searching through his other pockets with increasing desperation, his composure beginning to crack like ice under pressure. "I'm terribly sorry," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "I seem to have misplaced the key." A ripple of confusion passed through the audience. Mrs. Ashford rose from her chair, her expression shifting from gracious hostess to concerned patroness. "The key, Mr. Forrester. Surely the piano isn't locked." "I locked it myself after practicing this afternoon," he replied, his voice gaining strength but betraying an undercurrent of panic. "I always lock it. The mechanism is quite delicate, and I thought, but the key, I'm certain I had it." Mrs. Ashford turned toward the back of the room. "Ellen, do you have a spare key for the piano?" The housemaid, a sturdy country girl who had been hovering near the doorway, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "No, ma'am, I didn't know there was a lock on it. Mrs. Fielding never mentioned." She stopped abruptly, her face flushing. Mrs. Fielding had been the previous owner of Greenways, an elderly widow who had died the previous autumn under circumstances that had provided the village with several weeks of subdued gossip. "Well," said Mrs. Ashford with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to solving practical problems, "we shall simply have to force it open. Mr. Bantry, would you be so kind as to ask James to bring his tools? A small crowbar should suffice." The next few minutes passed in a flurry of activity that would have been comical under different circumstances. The butler, James, appeared with a collection of implements that looked more suited to burglary than musical performance. Several of the gentlemen offered their assistance, and soon the elegant drawing room resembled nothing so much as a workshop, with the beautiful piano as the unfortunate subject of their ministrations. Miss Marple watched the proceedings with the detached interest of someone observing a particularly complex piece of human theater. She noted that Julian Forrester stood well back from the piano during the forced entry, his face a mask of barely controlled emotion. She also noted that when the lock finally gave way with a sharp crack of splintering wood, several people in the room drew in their breath sharply, not with relief, but with something approaching dread. The fallboard was lifted, revealing the familiar pattern of black and white keys. But something was wrong. The keys themselves seemed to be depressed in an odd pattern, as if invisible fingers had been playing a silent chord. And there was something else, a faint, unpleasant odor that had nothing to do with the beeswax polish that gleamed on the piano's surface. It was Mrs. Bantry who screamed first, her voice cutting through the evening air like a blade. Others quickly joined her as they realized what they were seeing. For there, crammed into the space beneath the piano's lid, was the body of a man. He was small and elderly, dressed in the sober black suit of a professional man. His face was turned away, but Miss Marple recognized him immediately from the distinctive pattern of his thinning hair and the gold-rimmed spectacles that had fallen askew across his nose. It was Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, the village solicitor, a quiet, methodical man who had handled the legal affairs of half the families in St. Mary Mead for more than 30 years. And from the unnatural angle of his head and the dark stain spreading across the piano's internal mechanisms, it was quite clear that he was very thoroughly dead. Miss Marple remained seated as chaos erupted around her, while others screamed, fainted, or rushed about in various states of distress. She studied the scene with the calm attention of someone reading a particularly complex pattern in her knitting. The positioning of the body, the locked piano, the mysterious key that had gone missing. Each element was a stitch in a design that was only beginning to reveal itself. As Dr. Haydock arrived and began his preliminary examination, and as Constable Polk set about the business of securing the scene, Miss Marple found herself thinking about pianos that played after midnight, and about the curious fact that in her long experience, the most innocent gatherings often concealed the darkest secrets. The evening's entertainment had certainly exceeded everyone's expectations, though not quite in the manner Mrs. Ashford had intended. And as the first drops of, the promised rain began to patter against the drawing-room windows, Miss Marple reflected that St. Mary Mead was about to become a considerably more interesting place to live. The piano, she noted with a slight shiver, would never sound quite the same again. By morning, the story of the corpse in the piano had spread through St. Mary Mead with the relentless efficiency of spilled water finding every crack in a pavement. The milk delivery brought whispered conferences at kitchen doors. The postman carried more than letters on his rounds. And by 8 o'clock there was not a soul in the village who hadn't heard some version of the extraordinary events at Greenways Manor. Miss Marple sat in her garden with her second cup of tea, ostensibly deadheading roses but actually observing the unusual amount of foot traffic past her cottage gate. Her housemaid, Florence, had already provided 3 separate accounts of the discovery, each more embellished than the last, gathered from the baker's boy, the butcher's assistant, and Mrs. Bantry's cook. "They say he was folded up like a piece of laundry, miss," Florence reported with horrified fascination. "And that foreign pianist knew all along what was in there. Why else would he have the key and then pretend to lose it?" "Pretend is rather a strong word, Florence," Miss Marple observed mildly, snipping off a withered bloom. "Though I confess, the timing was remarkably unfortunate. One wonders what Mr. Forrester expected to find when the piano was opened." The sound of a motor car announced the arrival of Inspector Slack from Much Benham. his vehicle creating quite a stir as it navigated the narrow village lanes. Miss Marple had encountered the inspector on previous occasions and recognized him as a man who valued quick results over careful consideration, a tendency that could prove both helpful and dangerous in equal measure. Within the hour, Constable Polk appeared at her door, his helmet tucked under his arm and his notebook at the ready. He looked as though he'd aged several years since the previous evening. "Inspector Slack's compliments, Miss Marple," he began formally. "And he'd be obliged if you could come up to Greenways this afternoon to make a statement, like." "Of course, Constable. One must do one's duty." She paused in her knitting. "I trust the inspector is making progress with his inquiries?" Polk shifted uncomfortably. "Well, miss, he's got some very definite ideas about things. Seems to think the case is as good as solved already. That pianist fellow, well, he's in a proper state, and no mistake." After Polk departed, Miss Marple made her way to the village shops, where the morning's marketing provided an excellent opportunity for observation. At the post office, she encountered Mrs. Helena Crane, normally the village's most reliable source of gossip, sitting in uncharacteristic silence while her nephew, Timothy, fidgeted beside her. "Such a dreadful business," Miss Marple ventured gently. Mrs. Crane looked up sharply, her usual animated expression replaced by something approaching wariness. "Yes, quite shocking. Poor Mr. Blackwood, such a quiet, respectable man." "Indeed. I understand he was at Greenways yesterday afternoon on business." Timothy Crane's head snapped up at this, his face flushing. "Business? What sort of business?" His aunt's hand fell warningly on his arm. "Legal matters, I'm sure. Mr. Blackwood handled many people's affairs." Miss Marple noted the exchange with interest. The Crane's reaction suggested that Mr. Blackwood's final visit to Greenways might have been more significant than a simple matter of estate paperwork. At the greengrocer's, she found Mrs. Bantry in full flow, regaling the assembled customers with her eyewitness account. "The inspector is quite certain it's the pianist," she announced with authority. "After all, who else had access to the piano? And that business with the key? Well, it's perfectly obvious he was trying to delay the discovery." "Though one might ask," Miss Marple interjected quietly, "why a guilty man would draw such attention to himself. If Mr. Forrester had simply claimed illness, the piano might never have been opened at all." This observation created a momentary silence as the implications sank in. Mrs. Bantry looked slightly deflated, while several other customers began murmuring among themselves. The morning's intelligence gathering revealed several interesting threads. Mr. Blackwood had indeed visited Greenways on legal business, but the nature of that business remained unclear. Julian Forrester's behavior continued to puzzle everyone. His obvious distress seemed genuine, yet his connection to the locked piano remained suspicious. Most intriguing of all were the reactions of those who claimed to know nothing about the matter, yet seemed unusually affected by it. As Miss Marple returned home, she reflected on the curious mathematics of murder. A locked piano suggested premeditation, but the missing key implied either carelessness or deliberate misdirection. A body hidden in a musical instrument spoke of desperation, yet the choice of hiding place showed a certain twisted creativity. The inspector might believe he had his man, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most obvious solution was often the most misleading. In her experience, murder was rarely a simple matter of opportunity and means. It was the complex interplay of human emotions, long-buried secrets, and the fatal moment when civilized restraint finally snapped. She settled into her chair by the window, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. This afternoon's visit to Greenways would undoubtedly prove illuminating, though she suspected the real truth lay not in dramatic confessions, but in the small, overlooked details that revealed the darker harmonies beneath the village's peaceful surface. Greenways Manor, seen in the harsh light of afternoon, had lost much of its genteel charm. The gray stone looked stern under a sky of washed-out blue, and the windows glittered with an almost accusatory brightness. Miss Marple, stepping from the taxi that had conveyed her from the high street, noted the police car stationed in the gravel sweep and Constable Polk standing stiffly by the front door, as though determined to repel an invading army. The drawing room had been transformed into an impromptu headquarters for Inspector Slack's investigation. The piano stood like an accused prisoner in the corner, its violated lock a testament to the previous evening's horror. Police tape cordoned off the area, and a faint chemical smell lingered beneath the usual polish and flowers. Mrs. Ashford greeted Miss Marple with the strained civility of a hostess continuing to perform her role long after the party had been ruined. "My dear Miss Marple, this is all too ghastly. Inspector Slack insists I must refrain from straightening anything, as if I should dream of interfering with a murder investigation." Inspector Slack appeared with the aggressive certainty that marked his approach to criminal matters. "Ah, Miss Marple, thought we'd better have your account on record. Just need to confirm a few details about last evening." As Miss Marple recounted the previous evening's events, her eyes wandered to the piano, noting details that might escape a less observant witness. The sheet music still sat on the stand, Chopin's Nocturnes, and there were faint scratches around the damaged lock, suggesting previous tampering. "The evidence is quite clear," Slack declared with satisfaction. "We've recovered a brass candlestick from the music room mantelpiece, traces of blood on the base. Forrester had motive. He's nearly destitute, owes thousands to London creditors. He had opportunity, access to the piano and the house, and he had means." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. "Forgive me, Inspector, but wouldn't placing a body in the piano require considerable planning? If Mr. Blackwood was killed yesterday afternoon, how did the murderer know that Mr. Forrester would be unable to produce the key at the crucial moment?" Slack's face reddened. "The key business was obviously a performance. We found it this morning, tucked in his dresser drawer, hidden in a pair of rolled socks." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, "though I couldn't help noticing that several people seemed quite startled when the piano was opened, not merely shocked by the body, but surprised, as if they'd expected something else entirely." "What do you mean, something else?" "I'm not entirely certain, but the reactions were quite distinct, and it does raise questions about timing. Mr. Blackwood was expected at the musicale, yet no one reported him missing between yesterday afternoon and last evening." Mrs. Ashford looked startled. "He telephoned yesterday morning to confirm his attendance. After his afternoon visit about the will, I assumed he'd changed his mind. But Mr. Blackwood never changed his mind about social engagements, most punctilious about such matters." Before Slack could respond, raised voices drifted from the upper corridor. A young woman appeared at the head of the stairs, fashionably dressed in a manner suggesting London rather than village life. Short-waved hair, smart jade-green jumper, imitation pearls. "I tell you, Mother," she was saying, her cheeks flushed with anger, "you mustn't say another word to that odious man until I've spoken to Geoffrey. This could ruin everything." At the sight of the group below, she checked herself, then disappeared into a bedroom, closing the door with unnecessary force. "My niece Lydia," Mrs. Ashford explained with weary dignity. "She has what you might call a modern temperament." Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully on the closed door. Modern temperaments, she reflected, were often merely old tempers in shorter skirts. "One small thing, Inspector. Had the piano been tuned recently? I noticed the tuning hammer was still in the music room." "What's that got to do with anything?" "Perhaps nothing. Though odd, don't you think, for a piano that supposedly required such careful attention from Mr. Forrester." As Constable Polk escorted her out, Miss Marple found herself thinking about keys that appeared and disappeared, about reactions that revealed more than words, and about the curious mathematics of murder. The inspector might be convinced of Forrester's guilt, but she had learned that in matters of murder, the most convenient solution was rarely the correct one. The afternoon shadows were lengthening across the manor's grounds, and somewhere in the village, she was certain, the real truth was waiting to be discovered. The Red Lion had become the unofficial courthouse of St. Mary Mead, where verdicts were delivered nightly with the authority of 3 pints and local prejudice. Miss Marple, who rarely frequented such establishments, had nonetheless positioned herself in the adjoining tea-room, where a strategically placed mirror afforded her an excellent view of the proceedings through the connecting archway. The village had divided itself into camps, those convinced of Julian Forrester's guilt, and those who found the evidence suspiciously convenient. Dr. Haydock arrived at her table with the transparent excuse of checking on her rheumatism, though both understood he wished to discuss the medical aspects of the case with someone who wouldn't immediately broadcast his observations to the entire village. "The timing troubles me considerably," he said quietly, stirring his tea with unnecessary vigor. "Death occurred between 2 and 4, yesterday afternoon. Single blow to the back of the eye. Head with that candlestick. But here's the peculiar thing. When we opened that piano, the rigor mortis was all wrong. The body should have been considerably stiffer after so many hours." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. "You're suggesting the body was moved after rigor had passed? Or kept somewhere warmer before being placed in the piano? The internal temperature of that instrument would have been considerably cooler than room temperature." He frowned into his teacup. "There's something else. Blackwood's clothes were damp, not soaked, but definitely moist. Yet it didn't rain yesterday until well after 9 o'clock. Through her mirror, Miss Marple observed the evening's dramatis personae assembling in the public bar. Julian Forrester entered looking haggard, his clothes rumpled as though he'd slept in them. He'd been released on bail against Inspector Slack's better judgment, the magistrate having found the evidence largely circumstantial. Geoffrey Hendricks, the young solicitor's clerk, was already present, and the 2 men's eyes met across the room with an intensity suggesting more than casual acquaintance. Timothy Crane slipped in with the furtive air of someone hoping to avoid notice, making directly for Hendricks. Miss Marple noted their urgent, whispered conversation with interest. Young men with secrets, she reflected, often made poor conspirators. "I had an interesting conversation with Mrs. Clement earlier," Miss Marple remarked to Dr. Haydock. "It seems Mr. Forrester discovered something peculiar about the piano yesterday afternoon. The middle C sounded wrong, dull, as though something were pressing against the internal mechanism." "Good God," Haydock breathed. "You mean he knew something was inside?" "He suspected tampering with the strings, but the light was fading, and he was already late for dinner. So he locked the piano, intending to investigate properly in the morning. Then that telegram about his debts arrived, and he forgot everything until the performance." This revelation cast an entirely different light on the sequence of events. If Forrester had locked the piano in the late afternoon, the body must have been placed inside during daylight hours, in a house bustling with servants preparing for the evening's entertainment. Through the mirror she watched as Lydia Ashford swept into the public bar, her fashionable appearance drawing appreciative glances. She made directly for Geoffrey Hendricks, and even from a distance, Miss Marple could observe the young man's face flush with pleasure and alarm in equal measure. "Young love," Dr. Haydock observed dryly, following her gaze. "Though Mrs. Ashford won't approve, Hendricks hasn't a penny to his name, and Lydia's expected to marry advantageously." Miss Marple had also learned, through discreet inquiries, that Hendricks had recently been dismissed from his position in Macho, Benham, under circumstances suggesting financial irregularities. Timothy Crane, despite his aunt's comfortable circumstances, was rumored to be deeply in debt to London bookmakers, and Julian Forrester carried the burden of a scandal from his academy days, accusations of plagiarism that had destroyed a promising career. 3 young men, each harboring secrets that could ruin them. One elderly solicitor who knew too much about everyone's private affairs, and a piano that had become an instrument of death rather than music. The Evening Post had brought Miss Marple additional intelligence from London connections, small details that, when assembled, suggested a web of interconnected motives far more complex than Inspector Slack's simple theory of desperate poverty leading to murder. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple reflected that the piano had played its opening movement. The melody was beginning to reveal itself, though the final fatal chord remained tantalizingly beyond reach. In her experience, the most elaborate mysteries often had the simplest solutions, but this case seemed determined to prove the opposite. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, the real murderer was watching the investigation unfold, confident that suspicion would remain fixed on the obvious suspect. The performance, she was certain, was far from over. The morning mist hung over St. Mary Mead like a veil of discretion, concealing as much as it revealed. Miss Marple had learned long ago that murder investigations, like morning fog, required patience. The truth emerged gradually, detail by careful detail, until the complete picture stood clear in the light of understanding. She made her way to Greenway's Manor with the measured pace of someone who understood that haste often obscured the very evidence one sought to uncover. Ellen opened the door with the harried expression of a servant whose orderly world had been thoroughly disrupted. The girl's eyes were red-rimmed from sleeplessness, and her usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by nervous anxiety that spoke of secrets weighing heavily on her mind. "Ellen," Miss Marple said gently, settling herself in the servants' hall with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to extracting information through kindness rather than interrogation. "I wonder if you might help me understand the sequence of yesterday's events. Sometimes the smallest details prove most significant." The girl's relief at being asked to help rather than suspected was palpable. "Oh, yes, miss. I've been thinking about it all night, trying to remember everything proper-like." The timeline that emerged was illuminating. Geoffrey Hendricks had arrived at Greenway's on Monday, ostensibly to assist Mrs. Ashford with estate paperwork. Mr. Blackwood's visit yesterday afternoon had been specifically arranged to meet with the young man, a meeting that had grown increasingly heated as the afternoon progressed. "They was in the library from 2:30 until nearly 4, Ellen reported. "I heard raised voices when I brought the tea. Mr. Blackwood kept saying things like highly irregular and breach of professional ethics. Mr. Hendricks sounded desperate, miss, kept talking about making things right and having proof of everything." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked thoughtfully. "And after their meeting?" "Mr. Blackwood left looking thunderous, miss. Said he'd be returning for the musicale to settle matters once and for all." Mr. Hendricks went straight to the music room. I could hear him pacing about. Then there was this awful sound. "What sort of sound?" "Like something heavy falling inside the piano, miss. Then silence for the longest time. When I went to ask if he needed anything, he was just standing there, staring at the instrument like it had bit him." This revelation provided a crucial piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple had suspected that the piano's role in the crime was more complex than a simple hiding place, and Ellen's testimony suggested that something had been placed inside the instrument well before Mr. Blackwood's death. Her next discovery came through Mrs. Bantry, who arrived at mid-morning with intelligence gathered from the village's informal network of domestic servants. The previous week, while Mrs. Ashford was visiting her sister in London, a piano tuner had appeared at Greenway's, claiming to have been engaged to service the troublesome Middle Sea that had been bothering the household. "The peculiar thing," Mrs. Bantry reported with relish, "is that Mrs. Ashford never engaged any such person. The man simply appeared, worked for 3 hours, and left without presenting a bill. Ellen let him in because the piano had been sounding so odd." Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of recognition that accompanied the discovery of a significant clue. A stranger with access to the piano's internal mechanisms, working unsupervised in the house, could easily have prepared the instrument for its grim purpose. But who was this mysterious tuner, and what had he hidden inside the piano that would later accommodate a corpse? The afternoon brought additional intelligence from her network of village contacts. At the hardware store, she learned that Geoffrey Hendricks had purchased a gallon of paraffin 2 days earlier, claiming he needed it for cleaning old machinery. The chemist revealed that the same young man had also bought a substantial quantity of carbolic soap, far more than any reasonable cleaning task would require. These purchases suggested a deliberate attempt to remove evidence. But evidence of what? Miss Marple's experience had taught her that murderers often revealed themselves through their attempts at concealment, the very care they took to hide their crimes becoming the thread that led to their undoing. Her most significant discovery came through a chance encounter with Dr. Haydock, who had completed his preliminary examination of Mr. Blackwood's remains. The solicitor had indeed died from a single blow to the head, delivered with the brass candlestick found in the music room. But the condition of the body raised troubling questions about the sequence of events. The rigor mortis was all wrong, Dr. Haydock confided. The body showed signs of having been moved after death, then kept in a cool, confined space before being placed in the piano. And there's something else. Traces of paraffin on the clothing, as if someone had attempted to clean bloodstains. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing understanding. The crime was not a simple matter of murder and concealment, but a carefully orchestrated deception involving multiple locations and considerable preparation. Someone had killed Mr. Blackwood, hidden the body temporarily, then moved it to the piano as part of an elaborate scheme to implicate another person. But who was the intended victim of this frame? Julian Forrester seemed the obvious choice, given his access to the piano and his desperate financial circumstances. Yet Miss Marple had observed that the most obvious solution was rarely the correct one, particularly when it appeared to have been deliberately constructed for public consumption. As evening approached, she found herself thinking about pianos and tuners, about paraffin and bloodstains, about young men with secrets and old men with dangerous knowledge. The pattern was beginning to emerge, like a complex musical composition, where each instrument played its part in building toward a devastating crescendo. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a murderer was congratulating themselves on a crime perfectly planned and flawlessly executed. But Miss Marple had learned that perfection itself could be a flaw, and that the most elaborate deceptions often contained the seeds of their own destruction. The piano had indeed told its tale, though not in the way the killer had intended. Tomorrow, she reflected, would bring the moment when all the discordant notes would finally resolve into their proper harmony. Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with the satisfied air of a man who believed his case was all but closed. He declined her offer of tea, but accepted a seat in the morning room, spreading his notebook across the small table with proprietorial confidence. The investigation, he announced, was proceeding exactly as he had anticipated from the beginning. "The evidence against Forrester continues to mount," he declared, consulting his notes with obvious satisfaction. "We've established clear motive. The man was facing complete financial ruin. His aunt's legacy was tied up in a trust administered by Blackwood, contingent upon maintaining respectable employment and avoiding scandal. The solicitor had already refused one request for early release of funds, and Forrester was growing desperate." Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm as she listened. "How very interesting, Inspector, though I confess I'm curious about the timing. If Mr. Forrester was so desperate for money, wouldn't he have been more likely to attempt persuasion rather than murder? After all, a dead trustee hardly improves one's access to funds." Slack waved this observation aside with the impatience of a man who had no time for theoretical complications. "Desperate people don't always think clearly, Miss Marple. We have witnesses who heard Forrester and Blackwood arguing in London last month. The pianist made threats, said he'd find another way if Blackwood wouldn't cooperate." The morning brought additional visitors, each carrying fragments of information that gradually assembled themselves into a more complex picture. Ellen arrived first, her usual composure replaced by the nervous energy of someone carrying significant news. She had remembered something important about the music room, details that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now took on greater meaning. "The window over the shrubbery, miss," she reported earnestly. It had been stuck fast for weeks, painted shut according to James. But yesterday afternoon, after they found poor Mr. Blackwood, I noticed it was open just a crack. Someone had forced it from the outside. There were fresh scratches on the frame and paint chips on the sill. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. And who in the household would have had reason to open that particular window? That's just it, miss. The window opens onto the back garden, hidden from the main approach by the rhododendron bushes. Someone could have climbed through without being seen from the house or the drive. And there's something else. The carpet under the piano showed signs of being moved repeatedly, deep marks from the casters, as if the instrument had been rolled back and forth several times. This intelligence suggested a level of preparation that went far beyond a crime of passion. Someone had planned the murder carefully, including an escape route and a method for manipulating the piano's position. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the mysterious piano tuner who had appeared the previous week, claiming to service the troublesome Middle Sea. Her next caller was Mrs. Bantry, bearing news that cast the piano tuner in an even more suspicious light. Through her network of domestic contacts, she had learned that no piano tuner in the district had any record of being engaged for work at Greenways Manor. More significantly, the man had arrived with professional tools and demonstrated expert knowledge of the instrument's internal mechanisms. The peculiar thing, Mrs. Bantry reported with growing excitement, is that he spent most of his time working inside the piano rather than on the keys themselves. Ellen watched him through the doorway, said he was doing something to the framework, measuring spaces and testing the soundboard. When she asked about it later, he claimed he was checking for structural damage that might affect the tone. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the growing certainty that the piano had been prepared specifically for its grim purpose. Someone had studied the instrument's interior, calculated the available space, and possibly even modified the internal structure to accommodate what they intended to hide there. This level of premeditation suggested a mind both calculating and ruthless. The afternoon brought her most significant discovery yet. Dr. Haydock appeared with the results of his more detailed examination of Mr. Blackwood's remains, and his findings raised troubling questions about the sequence of events. The solicitor had indeed died from the blow to his head, but the condition of the body suggested a more complex timeline than anyone had previously considered. The rigor mortis patterns are quite definitive, he explained, settling into her parlor chair with the weary air of a man who had spent too many hours with unpleasant realities. Blackwood died between 2 and 4 on Tuesday afternoon, exactly as we initially determined. But here's the curious thing. The body shows clear evidence of having been kept in a cold, confined space for several hours before being placed in the piano. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. You're suggesting the piano wasn't the original hiding place? Precisely. The body was moved at least twice after death, first to somewhere considerably cooler than room temperature, a cellar perhaps, or an unheated outbuilding. Then, several hours later, it was transferred to the piano. The process would have required considerable physical strength and careful planning. This revelation transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the crime entirely. The murder hadn't been a spontaneous act, followed by panicked concealment. Instead, it was part of an elaborate scheme that involved multiple locations and careful timing. Someone had killed Mr. Blackwood, hidden the body temporarily, then moved it to the piano as part of a calculated plan to implicate Julian Forrester. As evening approached, she found herself contemplating the curious choreography of deception that was beginning to emerge. The mysterious piano tuner had prepared the instrument weeks in advance. The murderer had killed Blackwood and hidden the body in a temporary location. Then, at precisely the right moment, they had transferred the corpse to the piano, knowing that Forrester's performance would lead to its discovery in circumstances that would point directly to the pianist. But who possessed the technical knowledge to modify a piano, the physical strength to move a body multiple times, and the cold-blooded intelligence to orchestrate such an elaborate frame? Miss Marple had learned that the most Successful criminals were often those who remained invisible, whose presence was so commonplace that they attracted no suspicion even when engaged in the most extraordinary activities. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a murderer was congratulating themselves on a plan that had proceeded exactly as intended. They had eliminated Mr. Blackwood, implicated an innocent man, and remained safely concealed behind a wall of misdirection and false evidence. But Miss Marple had observed that elaborate deceptions, like complex musical compositions, often contained discordant notes that revealed the composer's true intentions. The piano had indeed told its story, though not the simple tale of desperate murder that Inspector Slack preferred to believe. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, and Miss Marple was confident that the careful pattern of evidence she had been assembling would finally reveal the identity of someone who had proven themselves both ingenious and utterly ruthless. The performance was approaching its climax, and she intended to be ready when the final revealing chord was struck. The morning brought a development that shifted the entire foundation of Inspector Slack's investigation. Julian Forrester possessed an unshakable alibi. Multiple witnesses had seen him at Much Benham railway station between 2:30 and 4 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, desperately attempting to reach his London creditors by telephone. The inspector's carefully constructed case against the pianist crumbled like poorly mixed mortar, leaving him to face the uncomfortable reality that his prime suspect was innocent. Miss Marple received this intelligence while tending her roses, but her attention was already focused elsewhere. The mysterious piano tuner had been troubling her thoughts, and she had spent the previous evening tracing his reported movements through the village's informal network of observers. The man had departed Greenways not toward the village proper, but along the old quarry road, a detail that sparked a memory of the abandoned ice house on the estate's boundary. Her afternoon walk to the crumbling stone structure confirmed her suspicions. The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, and inside the dank interior she discovered unmistakable evidence of recent use. The air carried the lingering scent of paraffin and carbolic soap, while on the stone floor lay a small brass screw identical to those used in piano mechanisms. Most significantly, a scrap of green wool clung to a splinter near the entrance, wool that matched the distinctive shade of the jumper Lydia Ashford had worn the previous day. This discovery explained Dr. Haydock's puzzling observations about the body's condition. The ice house had served as a temporary morgue, keeping Mr. Blackwood's remains cool while the murderer prepared the final stage of their elaborate deception. Someone had killed the solicitor, hidden him in this isolated location, then transferred the body to the piano at precisely the right moment to implicate Julian Forrester. Her next revelation came through Timothy Crane, whom she encountered outside the post office in a state of considerable agitation. Under gentle questioning, the young man's composure cracked entirely, revealing a web of financial irregularities that extended far beyond his own gambling debts. "Blackwood discovered everything," he confessed miserably. "Not just my borrowing from client accounts, but a whole scheme of falsified documents and diverted funds. He was going to expose us all unless the money was returned immediately. My career, my future, everything would have been destroyed." But Timothy's confession revealed something even more significant. "It wasn't just us younger men," he continued desperately. "Blackwood himself had been creative with certain estates over the years. Mrs. Ashford's finances, for instance. She's been living on borrowed time, taking advances against the estate without proper authorization. When Blackwood threatened to make everything public, she would have faced complete ruin." This intelligence cast Mrs. Ashford in an entirely new light. The gracious hostess, the acknowledged leader of village society, was actually a desperate woman, facing exposure and disgrace. Her motive for silencing Blackwood was far stronger than any of the younger men's financial troubles. Miss Marple's final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Julian Forrester, freed from suspicion but still haunted by the events, sought her out with observations that proved crucial to understanding the crime's preparation. "I keep thinking about that middle C," he told her, his hands trembling slightly. The action felt wrong for days before Tuesday. Someone had definitely tampered with the internal mechanism, wedged something inside that affected the key's response. I locked the piano specifically to prevent further interference until I could examine it properly. "And when did you first notice this problem?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "The day after that piano tuner visited. Mrs. Ashford claimed she'd never engaged anyone, but the work had definitely been done. The whole central section felt tight, compressed, as if space had been deliberately created inside the instrument. The pattern was finally becoming clear to Miss Marple's experienced eye. The crime had been planned weeks in advance, involving multiple conspirators with complementary skills and shared desperation. Someone had posed as a piano tuner to prepare the instrument for its grim purpose. Someone else had provided the temporary hiding place and the knowledge of the estate's layout. A third person had handled the actual killing and the complex logistics of moving the body twice. Mrs. Ashford's lack of surprise when the piano was opened now took on sinister significance. She had expected to find something inside that instrument, though perhaps not exactly what was revealed. The gracious hostess had orchestrated a performance far more elaborate than any musical, with herself as both director and leading actress. As evening shadows gathered over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the curious architecture of collaborative murder. The crime had required careful planning, technical skill, physical strength, and intimate knowledge of both the estate and the village's social dynamics. Tomorrow would bring the moment for revelation, when the carefully constructed symphony of deception would finally resolve into its true, discordant harmony. The piano had indeed told its story, though not the simple tale of desperate murder that Inspector Slack had preferred to believe. Instead, it had revealed something far more complex and dangerous, a conspiracy born of shared guilt and mutual necessity, orchestrated by someone who understood that the most successful crimes were those that appeared to solve themselves. The drawing room at Greenways Manor had been arranged like a courtroom, though Miss Marple suspected the proceedings would prove far more revealing than any formal trial. Inspector Slack had reluctantly agreed to this gathering after his case against Julian Forrester collapsed entirely, leaving him with a murder but no viable suspect. The assembled company represented all the principal players in the tragedy. Mrs. Ashford seated with rigid dignity in her customary chair, Lydia perched nervously beside Geoffrey Hendricks on the settee, Timothy Crane hovering near the doorway as though contemplating escape, and Dr. Haydock positioned by the window with the detached interest of a medical observer. Miss Marple settled herself in the wing chair with her knitting, appearing as innocuous as a village spinster could possibly appear. Yet her pale blue eyes held a steely determination that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. The technical foundation. "I have been thinking a great deal about pianos," she began conversationally, her needles clicking with metronomic precision. "Such complicated instruments, really. They require expert knowledge to maintain properly, and their internal mechanisms can conceal all manner of secrets, rather like people, when one considers it carefully." Her gaze settled on Geoffrey Hendricks, whose face had gone the color of old parchment. "Your father was a piano maker in Croydon before the war, wasn't he, Mr. Hendricks? You grew up surrounded by such instruments, learning the trade before circumstances forced you into legal work. When someone needed the piano prepared for an unusual purpose, you possessed exactly the right expertise." Geoffrey's silence confirmed her deduction more eloquently than any words. Lydia reached instinctively for his hand, her fashionable composure beginning to crack like ice under pressure. "The mysterious piano tuner who appeared last week, Miss," Marple continued gently. "Was you, of course. You knew precisely which braces could be shifted, which supports removed, without quite ruining the tone. It wouldn't do if the piano became obviously damaged before it served its final purpose." The physical evidence. "But preparing the piano was only the first movement in this elaborate composition," she observed, reaching into her knitting bag. "Moving a body requires considerable physical strength, and concealing it temporarily requires intimate knowledge of the estate's geography. She withdrew a small green thread, holding it up to catch the afternoon light. This wool fiber was found caught on a splinter at the icehouse door, the same distinctive shade as the jumper Miss Lydia wore on Tuesday afternoon. Someone had been using that abandoned building as a temporary storage facility. Lydia's composure shattered entirely. "I didn't know what was in there at first," she burst out, her voice breaking. "Mother said it was just papers, documents that needed to be hidden temporarily. She said we were protecting ourselves from false accusations." "Lydia!" Mrs. Ashford's voice cracked like a whip, but the girl had passed beyond her mother's control. "You thought it would just be evidence, didn't you, Mother? The forged transfers, the falsified estate records. Jeffrey said we could hide them in the piano where they'd be discovered dramatically, making it look like someone else was the real thief. He swore it would only be documents." The unraveling conspiracy. Miss Marple's needles paused as she absorbed this crucial revelation. So the original plan was merely to frame someone else for embezzlement, not murder, but someone decided that documents alone were insufficient insurance against Mr. Blackwood's threatened exposure. Timothy Crane, who had been growing paler by the moment, suddenly spoke from his position near the door. "She said it was an accident, that Blackwood had fallen during their meeting, struck his head on the library fender. She only needed help moving him temporarily while she decided what to do about the body." "But there was no accident, was there, Mr. Crane?" Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but her words cut through the room's tension like a blade. "The brass candlestick from the music room mantelpiece bears traces of Mr. Blackwood's blood. Someone struck him deliberately during their Tuesday afternoon meeting." Mrs. Ashford's composure, maintained through decades of village leadership, finally began to crack. "Cornelius Blackwood was a sanctimonious hypocrite," she said, her voice carrying the steel of someone who had commanded society for too long to surrender easily. He'd been manipulating estate accounts himself for years, taking his percentage while pretending moral superiority. When he threatened to destroy my reputation over practices he'd actively encouraged, I simply couldn't allow it. The complete picture. "The murder itself was spontaneous," Miss Marple continued, assembling the pieces with the precision of someone completing a complex pattern. "But the cover-up required the conspiracy you had already established. Mr. Hendricks had prepared the piano weeks earlier, creating space within the mechanism. Mr. Crane helped transport the body from the library to the icehouse, where it could be kept cool while you completed your arrangements." She turned her attention to the piano, still cordoned off in the corner. "That evening, while the household was busy preparing for the musicale, you moved Mr. Blackwood from the icehouse to the piano. The timing was crucial. The body had to be discovered during the performance, with Mr. Forrester present and apparently in control of the locked instrument." Dr. Haydock spoke from his position by the window. "That explains the rigor mortis patterns I observed. The body had been moved twice and kept in a significantly cooler environment before its final placement." "Precisely. And to ensure Mr. Forrester appeared guilty, you removed the correct key from his room and replaced it with another, one that wouldn't fit the lock, but would create the appearance of guilty knowledge when he fumbled with it publicly." The final confession. Mrs. Ashford straightened in her chair, and for a moment she resembled the commanding figure who had dominated village society for so many years. "Everything I did was to protect what I had built. This house, my position, my daughter's future, all of it would have been destroyed to satisfy Cornelius Blackwood's sudden attack of conscience. After years of quiet complicity in creative accounting, he decided to play the moral guardian. I simply couldn't allow it." The room fell silent, except for the steady click of Miss Marple's knitting needles. Inspector Slack cleared his throat, preparing to make the necessary arrests, but the elderly detective's voice stopped him once more. "There remains one final question," she said softly. "The telegram that arrived from Mr. Forrester on the morning of the performance, the one about his debts that so conveniently distracted him from investigating the piano's mechanism. Who arranged for that perfectly timed message, Mrs. Ashford?" The widow's silence was answer enough. Every detail had been orchestrated, every element carefully timed to create an elaborate frame that would have succeeded if not for the small, overlooked details that revealed the truth. Justice and resolution. As Constable Pock stepped forward with handcuffs for all three conspirators, Miss Marple reflected that murder, like music, required harmony between intention and execution. Mrs. Ashford had composed an elaborate symphony of deception, enlisting collaborators whose own guilt ensured their silence and cooperation. But she had forgotten that the most complex performances were also the most vulnerable to discordant notes. The piano had indeed played its part perfectly, revealing not just a body, but the intricate web of financial desperation, moral compromise, and collaborative guilt that had made murder seem like the only solution. In trying to frame an innocent man for their collective crimes, the conspirators had created a performance so elaborate that it ultimately exposed them all. The afternoon shadows were lengthening across the manor's grounds, and somewhere in the distance, the church bells chimed the hour with their familiar, comforting rhythm. St. Mary Mead would return to its peaceful routine, though the memory of this particular musicale would linger long after the last echoes of justice had faded into silence. The arrests proceeded with the peculiar dignity that characterized all significant events in St. Mary Mead, where even scandal must be conducted with proper decorum. Mrs. Ashford emerged from Greenway's Manor through the front door, her hat positioned with military precision and her gloves smoothed to perfection. For one brief moment, she surveyed the gathered villagers with the commanding presence that had made her the undisputed leader of local society for decades. Miss Marple, observing from behind the laurel hedge, recognized the expression of a general acknowledging defeat after a brilliantly fought campaign, one that had ultimately failed not through lack of strategy, but through the inexorable power of truth to surface, despite the most elaborate attempts at concealment. Geoffrey Hendricks and Timothy Crane were escorted through the side entrance with considerably less ceremony, their faces bearing the hollow look of men who had discovered that collaborative guilt provided no comfort when justice finally arrived. The young men had been swept along by Mrs. Ashford's forceful personality and their own desperate circumstances, but now they faced the consequences of choices that had seemed reasonable when viewed through the lens of shared fear and mutual necessity. Inspector Slack's professional awakening. Inspector Slack appeared at Miss Marple's cottage the following morning, his manner transformed by the uncomfortable recognition that his methods had nearly resulted in a catastrophic miscarriage of justice. He carried a comprehensive file detailing the evidence that would be presented at trial, his expression bearing the weary wisdom of someone who had learned an essential lesson about the dangers of accepting obvious solutions to complex problems. "I should have listened to your observations from the beginning," he admitted, accepting her offer of tea with uncharacteristic humility. The piano preparation, the body's multiple relocations, the timing of that telegram, it all seemed unnecessarily complicated when Forrester appeared such a convenient suspect. Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands, her pale blue eyes reflecting years of experience with human natures, capacity for elaborate deception. "Murder is rarely as straightforward as it initially appears, Inspector. Mrs. Ashford had spent decades building her position in village society, and she simply couldn't bear to see it destroyed by Mr. Blackwood's belated attack of conscience. When people believe their entire world is threatened, they become capable of extraordinary measures." The inspector consulted his notes, assembling the final pieces of the conspiracy's architecture. Geoffrey Hendricks had modified the piano under the pretense of routine maintenance, his father's trade providing the technical expertise necessary to create space within the instrument's mechanism. Timothy Crane had helped transport Mr. Blackwood's body from the library to the ice house, believing Mrs. Ashford's claim that the solicitor's death had been accidental. The telegram to Julian Forrester had been arranged through Mrs. Ashford's London connections, timed perfectly to arrive on the performance morning and ensure the pianist would be too distracted by financial worries to investigate the piano's altered tone. Individual resolutions and character fates, Julian Forrester called that afternoon, his relief at exoneration tempered by the horror of how close he had come to conviction for a crime he hadn't committed. "I keep thinking about that evening," he confessed, his hands still showing the tremor that had become habitual since his ordeal began. "Standing at the piano, fumbling with the wrong key while everyone watched. If the lock hadn't been forced, if the body had remained hidden even another day, the evidence against me would have seemed overwhelming." Miss Marple offered him tea and the wisdom born of observing human nature for more than 70 years. "You were chosen precisely because your circumstances made you vulnerable to suspicion." Mrs. Ashford understood people well enough to know that society readily believes the worst of those who appear desperate or troubled. "But remember, Mr. Forrester, the best remedy for traumatic memories is purposeful work. There are many pianos in the world that would benefit from your attention, and one unpleasant association can be overwhelmed by a multitude of better ones." He departed looking considerably steadier, his musical future secured by the release of his trust fund, and his reputation restored by the truth's emergence. Miss Marple watched him go with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the young possessed remarkable resilience when properly guided away from morbid preoccupations. Lydia Ashford proved more complex to resolve. Miss Marple encountered her in the churchyard several days later, the girl's fashionable appearance incongruous among the weathered headstones and ancient yew trees. "You must think me quite dreadful," Lydia said without preamble, her usual confidence replaced by genuine uncertainty. "Helping to hide things, pretending ignorance when I should have asked the right questions." "Most people avoid asking questions when the answers might prove inconvenient," Miss Marple replied gently. "It's a common failing that leads to more trouble than outright wickedness, in my experience. But you've had a sharper lesson than most girls your age about where willful blindness can lead. That knowledge, properly applied, might make you more dependable than many apparently blameless young ladies, provided you choose your companions with greater care in future." Village social dynamics and community processing. The village adapted with the remarkable resilience that Miss Marple had observed in countless communities faced with extraordinary events. Within days, the most lurid speculations had crystallized into manageable narratives that allowed normal life to resume. At the post office, Mrs. Crane was already recasting her nephew's involvement as the tragic mistake of a misguided youth rather than criminal conspiracy. The butcher pronounced that the trouble had started when widows began living alone in large houses without proper male supervision. At the Red Lion, consensus formed that the true villain was London influence, which apparently corrupted everyone who encountered it. Dr. Haydock, joining Miss Marple for tea later that week, marveled at the conspiracy's complexity. "What astonishes me is how ordinary people managed such elaborate wickedness. If you'd asked me a month ago to identify the 3 most likely conspirators in the village, I doubt I'd have chosen that particular combination." "They were perfectly suitable," Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. "One must look for people whose weaknesses complement each other. Mrs. Ashford provided position and desperation. Mr. Hendricks contributed technical skill and resentment. Young Mr. Crane offered fear and foolishness. Separately, each might have committed only minor transgressions. Together, they became capable of anything." Miss Marple's final philosophical reflections. As evening approached, Miss Marple sat in her garden, watching the last light fade from the summer sky. The piano at Greenways would never be played again. It had been sold immediately, its new owners unaware of its grim history. The musical that was intended to showcase Julian Forrester's talent had instead revealed the darker harmonies of human nature, the discordant notes of greed, fear, and moral compromise that could transform respectable citizens into collaborative murderers. She reflected on the curious mathematics of shared guilt and how ordinary people could rationalize extraordinary crimes when they believed their entire world was threatened. Mrs. Ashford had convinced herself that Mr. Blackwood deserved his fate because he had been complicit in the same financial manipulations he suddenly decided to expose. Geoffrey Hendricks had told himself he was merely preparing a hiding place for documents rather than a corpse. Timothy Crane had believed he was helping conceal an accident rather than participating in murder. Each had contributed to the crime while maintaining the fiction that they were doing something less monstrous. "We are all capable of such things under the right circumstances," she murmured to herself, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Fear, pride, greed, the oldest motives remain the strongest, and sometimes the most dangerous people are those who seem most respectable, who have spent years building facades of respectability that they will do anything to preserve. Atmospheric return to village normalcy. The clock on her mantelpiece chimed the hour with its familiar, comforting rhythm, a reminder that time moved forward, carrying both new mysteries and the promise of their eventual resolution. St. Mary Mead would recover from this scandal as it had recovered from others, though the memory would linger in whispered conversations and carefully edited accounts of village history. Murder, like music, left echoes that persisted long after the final notes had been struck. The piano had played its last, revealing not just a body, but the intricate web of deception that had made killing seem like the only solution to problems that might have been resolved through honesty and courage. Human nature remained unchanged beneath the peaceful surface of village life, capable of great kindness and terrible cruelty, often within the same heart. Miss Marple picked up her knitting needles and resumed her pattern, the familiar motions soothing her thoughts. The mystery was solved. Justice had been served, and order had been restored to her small corner of the world. For now, the piano was silent, the performance was over, and the ordinary life of St. Mary Mead could quietly continue, enriched by the shared memory of extraordinary events and the knowledge that truth, however deeply buried, would eventually find its way to the surface. Outside, the church clock chimed once more, and Miss Jane Marple reflected that there would always be new patterns to unravel, new harmonies to decode in the endless, fascinating symphony of human behavior. The trial at the Old Bailey concluded in early November, with sentences that reflected both justice and mercy in their careful calibration. Mrs. Ashford received 15 years' imprisonment, her dignity intact, even as the judge pronounced her fate, with the measured solemnity that marked the end of a life dedicated to respectability. Geoffrey Hendricks and Timothy Crane, their youth and evident remorse weighing in their favor, received shorter terms that acknowledged their roles as followers rather than architects of the conspiracy. Miss Marple attended only the sentencing, sitting in the public gallery with her knitting as the legal machinery transformed village tragedy into official record. She observed how Mrs. Ashford maintained her composure to the end, accepting responsibility for her actions while never quite acknowledging the full horror of what she had orchestrated. It was, Miss Marple reflected, entirely characteristic of someone who had spent decades managing appearances rather than confronting uncomfortable truths. The fates of the survivors. St. Mary Mead absorbed these developments with the philosophical resignation of a community that had witnessed human nature in all its complexity. Julian Forrester departed for Paris in December, his inheritance restored and his reputation cleared, though Miss Marple suspected he would carry invisible scars from his brush with judicial catastrophe. He sent her a gracious note expressing gratitude, along with sheet music for a nocturne he had composed. Written in daylight, he noted, where shadows cannot hide unwelcome secrets. Lydia Ashford found employment with a charitable organization in Bath, her letters to Miss Marple revealing a young woman gradually discovering her own moral compass after years of following her mother's magnetic but ultimately destructive guidance. The fashionable superficiality had been replaced by something deeper and more genuine, though Miss Marple suspected the transformation would require years to complete fully. Greenway's Manor stood empty through the winter. its elegant rooms gathering dust while solicitors untangled the financial web that had precipitated the entire catastrophe. The piano had been sold to a music academy in Devon, where Miss Marple hoped it would find redemption through countless hours of student practice, its dark associations gradually overwhelmed by scales and etudes performed by young people whose lives remained blessedly uncomplicated by murder. The village's recovery. By spring, the most lurid aspects of the scandal had crystallized into manageable local legend. The younger residents found the whole affair rather thrilling in retrospect, while their elders used it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of social ambition and financial irregularities. Mrs. Bantry pronounced the entire business a perfect example of why widows should not attempt to manage large establishments without proper male supervision, while the vicar delivered carefully worded sermons about pride and the importance of honest confession. Dr. Haydock, visiting Miss Marple on a particularly fine April afternoon, marveled at the village's resilience. Life simply continues, doesn't it? As though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Life always continues, Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm as she watched children play in the lane beyond her garden gate. People adapt, memories fade, and new concerns replace old ones. It's rather like music, really. Each movement gives way to the next, and eventually the entire composition finds its proper resolution. Miss Marple's final reflections. The piano that played after midnight had taught St. Mary Mead essential lessons about the darkness that could lurk beneath respectable surfaces, about how ordinary weaknesses might crystallize into extraordinary crimes when pride and fear overwhelmed moral restraint. Mrs. Ashford had seemed the embodiment of propriety and social leadership, yet she had killed without hesitation when her carefully constructed world faced exposure. Miss Marple had learned long ago that murder was rarely the simple crime of passion that people preferred to imagine. This case had required technical skill, elaborate planning, and the psychological manipulation of vulnerable accomplices, proof that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most respectable, who had spent years building facades they would do anything to preserve. As evening approached and the church bells chimed the hour with their familiar, comforting rhythm, Miss Marple reflected that even the darkest mysteries eventually yielded to patient observation and the unwavering belief that truth possessed its own inexorable harmony. The piano was silent now, its story told, its lessons absorbed by those wise enough to listen carefully to the discordant notes that revealed deception beneath apparent respectability. Tomorrow would bring new observations, fresh puzzles to unravel in the endlessly fascinating study of human behavior. The world did not stop being itself because one mystery had been solved. New patterns were always forming, new harmonies and dissonances arising from the eternal concert of village life. When the next false note sounded, Miss Jane Marple would be listening, apparently absorbed in her knitting, while her mind attended closely to the invisible hand that had touched the keys. The evening star appeared above the church spire, and Miss Marple gathered her needles with quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, order restored, and life would continue its eternal rhythms. The piano that played after midnight had finally found its proper silence, and St. Mary Mead could return to the peaceful business of being itself, though perhaps with ears slightly more attuned to the subtle discords that might herald the next disturbance in their tranquil symphony. The summer of the following year settled over St. Mary Mead, with a particular golden quality that seemed to wash away the last shadows of the Greenways affair. The village gardens bloomed in riotous profusion, roses climbing cottage walls and delphiniums standing sentinel in neat borders, while the air hummed with the industrious sound of bees that knew nothing of murder and cared even less for human scandals. Into this pastoral tranquility came Raymond West, Miss Marple's nephew, arriving with his London restlessness and a writer's determination to transform the previous year's tragedy into high art. The writer's romantic vision, Raymond had positioned himself in the garden chair beneath the oak tree, looking elegantly out of place in his cream linen suit, cigarette holder gesturing dramatically as he expounded his literary theories. He had spent the morning interrogating his aunt about every detail of the Ashford case, planning to use it as the foundation for his next novel, tentatively titled The Discordant Note. "The tragedy of it, Aunt Jane," he declared with the passionate conviction of someone who had never witnessed actual tragedy, "is truly Greek in its proportions. Mrs. Ashford represents the cultivated woman driven to madness by the threat of losing her artistic sanctuary. She's a Clytemnestra figure, sacrificing morality on the altar of aesthetic perfection. I shall portray her as a tortured genius who loved beauty so intensely that she destroyed herself to preserve it." Miss Marple paused in her gentle weeding, her gardening gloves covered with honest earth, and regarded her brilliant nephew with the affectionate tolerance she usually reserved for the butcher's boy when he delivered the wrong cut of meat. The Morning Post had brought letters from Paris and Bath, updates from the case's survivors that painted a rather different picture than Raymond's romantic imaginings. The reality behind the romance. "That sounds very dramatic, dear," she observed mildly, pulling up a particularly stubborn dandelion. "And I'm sure it will sell a great many copies, but I'm afraid you have the character entirely backward. Poor Mrs. Ashford wasn't a tortured genius, nor was she particularly cultivated. She was, in point of fact, very much like Mrs. Elmsley, who used to run the sweet shop near the vicarage." Raymond's artistic vision wavered slightly. "Mrs. Elmsley? The woman who was arrested for watering down the ginger beer?" "Precisely. Mrs. Elmsley didn't care a whit about ginger beer, just as Mrs. Ashford didn't care a whit about music. They both cared about profit and position, about maintaining appearances they couldn't actually sustain." Miss Marple dusted off her hands with deliberate care. "You see, Raymond, you're looking for grand passions where there was only petty vanity. Mrs. Ashford didn't kill Mr. Blackwood to protect art. She killed him because she couldn't bear the village knowing she was a fraud." The morning's correspondence had reinforced this understanding. Julian Forrester's latest letter from Paris described his renewed career with cautious optimism, though he confessed that certain pieces, particularly Chopin's nocturnes, still carried unwelcome associations. Lydia Ashford's notes from Bath showed a young woman gradually constructing a new identity from the ruins of her privileged assumptions, while Timothy Crane's infrequent communications revealed someone slowly rebuilding his character in a Canadian lumber camp, far from the temptations that had nearly destroyed him. The crucial revelation. "There was one detail I never mentioned to the police," Miss Marple continued, settling back in her chair with her knitting, "largely because Inspector Slack finds such things irritatingly abstract, but it proves the point quite conclusively." Raymond leaned forward, his writer's instincts sensing a significant revelation. "What was that?" "It concerned the piano tuning, or rather, Mrs. Ashford's complete inability to notice when the instrument was ruined." Miss Marple's needles began their familiar rhythm as she explained. "Julian Forrester had complained for days that the piano was unplayable. The middle register was dull, the action was heavy, and the tone was completely flat because of Mr. Hendricks's modifications. To any person with a genuine ear for music, that piano would have sounded like a bag of spanners being dropped down a staircase." She paused to observe a robin investigating her flower bed before continuing. "Mrs. Ashford lived in that house for 3 days while the piano was in that condition. She walked past it multiple times, claimed to check the arrangements for her musicale, even sat in the room while Julian attempted to practice. Yet she never noticed anything wrong. She allowed the performance to proceed, not because she was ruthlessly determined, but because she was entirely tone-deaf. She couldn't distinguish a Bechstein from a barrel organ." The banality of evil Raymond absorbed this deflation of his tragic heroine, watching his operatic vision shrink into something smaller, meaner, and infinitely more pathetic. a woman who had committed murder to protect a reputation for culture she didn't actually possess. "It's often the way with evil, Raymond," Miss Marple observed softly, her gaze drifting toward the church tower where the afternoon bells would soon chime. "We want it to be grand and mysterious, born of terrible passions and noble corruptions. But usually, it's just someone like Mrs. Ashford or Mrs. Elmsley, trying to keep up appearances and cutting corners until they cut a throat instead. It's not Greek tragedy, dear. It's merely the small, sordid business of putting oneself first, carried to its ultimate conclusion." Dr. Haydock had expressed similar thoughts during his recent visit, marveling at how 3 ordinary people had convinced themselves that murder was merely an extension of their existing deceptions. Mrs. Ashford had rationalized Blackwood's death because he threatened her carefully constructed facade. Geoffrey Hendricks had told himself he was only preparing a hiding place for documents. Timothy Crane had believed he was helping conceal an accident. Each had maintained their innocence while contributing to collaborative homicide, village recovery, and eternal patterns. The village itself had demonstrated remarkable resilience in absorbing the scandal. Greenway's Manor now housed a retired colonel and his wife from Hampshire, sensible people who had converted the music room into a library and expressed no interest in the property's dramatic history. The piano had been sold to a music academy in Devon, where Miss Marple hoped countless hours of student practice would gradually overwhelm its dark associations with scales and etudes. Local memory had already begun its selective editing, transforming Mrs. Ashford into either a cold-blooded villainess or a pitiable victim, depending on the storyteller's temperament. The complex reality of moral compromises accumulated over years, of pride overwhelming conscience, of ordinary weakness crystallizing into extraordinary crime, proved too nuanced for comfortable village narrative. Philosophical resolution. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the garden, Miss Marple gathered her tools and prepared for tea. Florence had made seed cake, and unlike Mrs. Ashford's pretensions to culture, Florence's genuine talent deserved proper appreciation. "Now, Raymond," she said briskly, reverting to her practical tone, "if we don't go in soon, Florence will be most put out, and I've learned that authentic skill, however humble, is infinitely more valuable than elaborate pretense, however impressive it may appear." Raymond offered his aunt his arm, realizing with sudden humility that while he might write the stories, it was the elderly lady with the gardening gloves who truly understood the characters. The piano that played after midnight had revealed not just a corpse, but the intricate architecture of human self-deception, the way ordinary people could rationalize extraordinary crimes when pride and fear overwhelmed moral restraint. The eternal concert continues. Tomorrow would bring new observations, fresh patterns to decode in the endless symphony of village life. The world continued its eternal rhythms regardless of individual tragedies, new dramas replacing old ones with the inevitability of seasons changing. When the next false note sounded in St. Mary Mead's peaceful harmony, Miss Jane Marple would be listening, her knitting needles moving steadily, while her mind attended to the invisible patterns that revealed truth beneath deceptive surfaces. The church bells chimed the hour as they walked toward the cottage, their familiar rhythm marking time's passage with comforting regularity. The piano had played its final chord, its story complete, but human nature remained unchanged, capable of great kindness and terrible cruelty, often within the same heart. In the gathering dusk, St. Mary Mead settled into another peaceful evening, absorbing its latest lesson about the curious mathematics of justice and the eternal fascinating drama of ordinary people confronted with extraordinary circumstances. The performance was nearly over, but Miss Marple knew the concert of human behavior would continue as long as people gathered in communities, bringing their hopes and fears, their virtues and vices, to the endless, complex symphony of village life. The winter of the following year settled over St. Mary Mead with the particular stillness that follows great disturbances when a community has absorbed its shock and returned to the eternal rhythms of ordinary life. Miss Marple sat in her morning room with the afternoon post spread before her, a collection of letters that provided the final accounting of the Greenways affair and its aftermath. The fates of the conspirators. Julian Forrester's correspondence from Vienna brought news of genuine rehabilitation. His position at the conservatory had restored both his confidence and his reputation, while his latest letter mentioned a promising young pianist who reminded him, he wrote with characteristic understatement, that music could indeed triumph over its darker associations. The tremor had finally left his handwriting, replaced by the steady hand of someone who had found peace with his past. Geoffrey Hendricks had written from Melbourne, where his father's trade had found honest expression in a piano workshop that specialized in restoring damaged instruments. His letter to Forrester, shared with Miss Marple's permission, revealed a young man who had confronted his fundamental weaknesses and built something better from the ruins. I spend my days returning broken pianos to their proper voices, he had written. It seems fitting work for someone who helped silence one so permanently. Timothy Crane's trajectory proved more troubling. Initial reports from Canada had suggested authentic transformation, but recent intelligence indicated his return to England and involvement in questionable ventures in Manchester. Miss Marple reflected that some people learned from their mistakes, while others merely learned to make different mistakes with greater sophistication. Mrs. Ashford herself had died the previous winter in Holloway Prison, carried off by pneumonia with the same rigid dignity she had maintained throughout her trial. Her final letter to Lydia, reluctantly shared, revealed a woman who had never grasped that her real crime was not the murder itself, but the decades of self-deception that had made murder seem reasonable. She had maintained to the end that circumstances, rather than character, had been her downfall. The village's philosophical reckoning. Dr. Haydock's afternoon visit provided opportunity for deeper reflection on the case's enduring lessons. They sat in Miss Marple's parlor while Florence's excellent seed cake provided tangible comfort against winter's melancholy, discussing the curious architecture of collaborative guilt that had made the crime possible. What fascinates me still, Haydock observed, stirring his tea with unnecessary concentration, is how three people convinced themselves they were committing three different crimes when they were actually all participating in murder. Mrs. Ashford believed she was protecting her social position. Hendricks thought he was merely hiding documents. Young Crane imagined he was concealing an accident. Miss Marple's knitting. Needles paused briefly. It's the usual pattern when ordinary people commit extraordinary crimes. They construct elaborate justifications that allow them to avoid confronting what they're actually doing. Mrs. Ashford was particularly skilled at such self-deception. She had spent decades perfecting the technique for smaller transgressions. The case had taught her something she had suspected but never quite articulated, that the most dangerous criminals were often those who had spent years constructing elaborate fictions about themselves, building identities so fragile that any threat to their foundations triggered catastrophic responses. Mrs. Ashford had not been driven by overwhelming passion, but by the accumulated weight of countless small moral compromises, until the distinction between acceptable deception and unthinkable crime had been eroded entirely. Symbolic redemption and musical resurrection. The Afternoon Post had brought particularly satisfying news from the Music Academy in Devon. The headmistress wrote that the Bechstein Grand was proving a magnificent asset to the school, with a gifted scholarship student named Arthur preparing for his first recital on the instrument. Miss Marple found deep satisfaction in this image, an instrument that had been corrupted to conceal death, now serving as a vessel for new life and beauty. It represented the sort of moral equilibrium that Mrs. Ashford's vanity had so violently disturbed. The piano's redemption seemed to Miss Marple a perfect metaphor for the case's deeper meaning. Just as the instrument's beautiful voice had been temporarily silenced by hidden corruption, so had the conspirators' better natures been overwhelmed by accumulated deceptions. But while the piano could be restored to its proper function through honest work, human redemption proved more complex and uncertain. The eternal concert continues. As evening approached and the church bells chimed the hour with their familiar, comforting rhythm, Miss Marple reflected that St. Mary Mead had absorbed the scandal with remarkable resilience. New families had arrived, bringing fresh concerns to occupy the village's attention. The Greenways affair was already crystallizing into local legend, its sharp edges smoothed by repetition, until Mrs. Ashford would likely be transformed into either a theatrical villainess or a pitiable victim, depending on the storyteller's temperament. Such transformations were inevitable. People preferred their criminals comprehensible and their motives dramatic, even when reality offered neither quality. The complex truth of moral compromises accumulated over years, of pride overwhelming conscience, of ordinary weakness crystallizing into extraordinary crime, proved too nuanced for comfortable village narrative. Miss Marple's eternal vigilance. The world continued its eternal rhythms regardless of individual tragedies, new mysteries replacing old ones with the inevitability of seasons changing. Tomorrow would bring fresh observations, different patterns to decode in the endless symphony of human behavior. When the next false note sounded in St. Mary Mead's peaceful harmony, Miss Jane Marple would be listening, her knitting needles moving steadily, while her mind attended to the invisible architecture of truth beneath deceptive surfaces. She gathered her correspondence and prepared for the evening routine, knowing that while this particular mystery had been solved, the eternal, complex concert of village life would continue to provide new puzzles for those patient enough to observe carefully. The piano that played after midnight had taught its final lesson about the curious mathematics of justice and the enduring fascination of human nature, capable of great kindness and terrible cruelty, often within the same heart. The performance was over. The final chord had been struck, but Miss Jane Marple remained ready for the next movement in the endless, compelling symphony of human behavior that played on, day after day, in the deceptively peaceful village of St. Mary Mead.